Can I paint your bikes for tips? The garage went dead silent for exactly 2 seconds, and then 90 grown men started laughing. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, just stood there in the middle of all that noise, 18 years old, a worn backpack on her shoulders, and a box of paintbrushes tucked under her arm waiting for them to finish. When they finally did, she opened her sketchbook and set it on the table. The laughter stopped so fast it was like someone cut a wire. Because what they saw in that book didn't look like a teenager's hobby. It looked like a ghost had come home. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The summer heat in rural Arizona doesn't ask permission. It sits on your chest from the moment you step outside, heavy and absolute, the kind of heat that makes everything feel like it costs more than it should. Emma Parker had been riding Greyhound buses for 11 hours when the driver dropped her at the junction. No one was there to meet her. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. That was the point. She was 18 years old, 5'4", and weighed maybe 120 pounds if you counted the backpack. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's eyes, dark brown, quiet, the kind that saw more than they let on. She'd heard that description her whole life from people who'd known Daniel Parker, and she'd spent most of those years trying to decide whether it was a compliment or a warning. The road from the junction to the clubhouse was 3 miles of cracked asphalt and scrub brush. She walked all of it. She heard the clubhouse before she saw it. The deep rolling growl of motorcycle engines warming up the crack of metal on metal from the garage bays, voices carrying across open ground with the particular confidence of men who had never had a reason to lower them. She'd heard that sound in her sleep for years, in the half-memories that weren't quite memories, more like impressions left over from being 5 years old and sitting on her father's shoulders while the world rumbled around her. She stopped at the edge of the lot and looked at the building. It was larger than she'd imagined, the kind of structure that had grown over decades, edition by edition, every era leaving its own marks. American flags. A mural on the east wall, faded now, but still recognizable, a skull with wings painted in the style she knew better than any other. She stood still for a long moment looking at that mural. Then she pushed open the gate and walked in. There were 93 people on the lot that Saturday. She would learn that number later. It was a regional gathering, chapters from 4 states coming together for the annual memorial ride that would leave the following morning. Some of them had been riding together for 30 years. Some were newer, in their 40s or 50s, men and women who had come up in the organization long after the stories she was chasing had already become legend. Nobody noticed her right away. She was careful about that. She moved through the edge of the crowd, reading the space, watching who talked to whom and who deferred to whom and where the real weight of the room settled. Her mother had called this habit unsettling in a girl. Emma had always thought of it as practical. She found the chapter president near the main garage bay. Jack Sullivan Hammer, to everyone on the lot, was 58 years old and built like a man who had spent 5 decades doing physical work and not apologizing for it. His hair was silver gray, cropped close. His arms were covered from wrist to shoulder in ink, decades of artwork layered over each other, and his face had the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that most situations didn't require a reaction until you'd finished deciding what you thought about them. He was examining a fuel tank with 2 other men when Emma walked up. "Excuse me," she said. All 3 men turned. Hammer looked at her the way experienced people look at unexpected things, not dismissive, not welcoming, just neutral, gathering information. "You looking for someone?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," Emma said. "I paint motorcycles. I was wondering if anyone here needed custom work done." She paused. "I work for tips." The 2 men on either side of Hammer exchanged a glance. One of them, a thick-shouldered man in his 40s named Deke, started smiling. "Sweetheart," Deke said, "half the people in this lot have been painting bikes since before you were born." "I know," Emma said. "I'm not trying to compete with them. I'm asking if there's work." Hammer still hadn't changed his expression. "What kind of work?" "Any kind. Tanks, fenders, helmets. I can do portraits, landscapes, symbolic work." She shifted the backpack on her shoulder. "I can also do restoration. If something's been damaged or faded, I can match original work. Closely." Deke laughed outright at that. He called over to 3 other men nearby. "Hey kid, here says she can restore original custom work. Says she does portraits." He said it the way you'd announce a punchline you were setting up. The laughter spread fast, not cruel exactly the way laughter spreads in a crowd that's relaxed and in a good mood and happy for entertainment. Emma stood in the middle of it and waited. Hammer raised one hand slightly, not a command, just a gesture, and the noise settled. "Let me see your sketchbook," he said. Emma unzipped her backpack, took out the sketchbook, and laid it flat on the workbench between them. The laughter died completely. Hammer didn't speak for almost a full minute. He turned pages carefully with the particular deliberateness of someone who understood what they were looking at and needed to be sure they were seeing it correctly. The two men flanking him leaned in. Deke's smile had evaporated entirely. The drawings were extraordinary. That was the only word that fit. Not impressive for her age, not promising, not good, extraordinary, full stop. Motorcycle portraits rendered with a technical precision that shouldn't have been possible with pencil and charcoal. Wing designs of a complexity that required both mechanical knowledge and genuine artistic instinct. Portraits of men on bikes that captured something beyond likeness. They captured the particular quality of stillness that men carry when they've spent decades doing one thing and loving it. But it was the style that stopped Hammer cold. He knew that style. Every man over 40 on that lot knew that style. He looked up from the sketchbook slowly. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" he asked. His voice was still measured, but something had shifted in it. Emma met his eyes. "My father taught me," she said. Hammer studied her face. "Who's your father?" she told him. The name hit the garage like a stone dropping into still water, and the silence that followed spread outward in rings. Daniel Parker. The name moved through the crowd faster than Emma could track. She watched it happen the way a word travels through a group of people who all share the same reaction to it, passing from face to face like a current. Men who had been 20 feet away drifted closer without quite realizing they were doing it. Conversation stopped. Someone set down a wrench. Hammer hadn't looked away from her. "Daniel Parker," he said slowly. "Daniel Parker's daughter." "Emma Parker," she said. "I'm 18. I've been looking for information about what happened to him for 3 years. She held his gaze. "I was told some of the people who knew him best would be here this weekend. So I came." Hammer looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back down at the sketchbook. "Where's your mother?" he asked. "Tucson. She doesn't know I'm here." "She know about this?" He gestured at the sketchbook. "The drawings. Yes. The trip, no." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Hammer's face and then disappeared. He closed the sketchbook carefully and pushed it back across the workbench toward her. "Can you do tanks?" he said. "Yes." "You ever done a full custom job? Not sketches, actual paint on metal?" "Since I was 12, Emma said. "I've done 47 bikes. I have photographs if you want to see them." Hammer was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Deke. "Pull the old Sportster out of the back," he said. "The bare one." Deke stared at him. "Hammer." "The bare one," Hammer repeated. "Give her what she needs." Oiko. They gave her a stripped fuel tank and fender off a 1978 Sportster that had been sitting in the back of the garage for 2 years, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. They gave her access to the paint supplies along the back wall, a professional setup, the kind of equipment that serious custom painters used, and they stepped back. What happened over the next 2 hours was something that most of the men there would describe differently, depending on who asked them, and all of those descriptions would be accurate. Some of them said she was fast. Others said she was slow, methodical, almost meditative. Both were true. She moved quickly when the work required speed and held absolutely still when it required stillness, and she seemed to always know which was which. Some of them said she barely looked at the metal, while she worked like her hands were operating independently of her eyes. Others said she never looked away, that her focus was total and unbroken. Both of those were true too. But what all 93 people agreed on, every single one of them, when they talked about it afterward, was the moment around the 90-minute mark when Pete Larson, 61 years old, and a member of the chapter for over 30 years, walked up to the tank where Emma was working, looked at what she was doing, and had to walk away and sit down by himself for 5 minutes. Pete had ridden with Daniel Parker, had watched him paint, had sat in this same garage 2 decades ago and watched Daniel work on a fuel tank in exactly this way, with exactly this quality of attention, making exactly these choices about color and line and negative space. He knew what he was looking at. When he came back, his eyes were red. He didn't say anything about that. He just stood behind Emma and watched her finish. When Emma set down her brush and stepped back from the tank, nobody spoke for a moment. The artwork was extraordinary, not in a way that required explanation or expertise to appreciate the kind of extraordinary that simply hits you in the chest before your brain has time to categorize it. A complex design built around the club's traditional imagery, rendered with a technical mastery that belonged to someone with decades of practice, not 2 years of serious study. But layered within the larger design, almost invisible unless you knew to look, were the details that made Pete Larson's hands shake. Hidden symbols, small and precise, worked into the negative space of the wings. Road markings embedded in the border work. A small signature flourish in the lower left corner. Not initials, not a name, just a particular curved line that functioned like a fingerprint. Daniel Parker's fingerprint. Hammer stood in front of the tank for a long time without speaking. When he finally turned to look at Emma, his face was unreadable. "Your father show you all of this?" he asked. "The symbols, the hidden marks?" "Everything I know he taught me," Emma said. "Some of it I learned from him directly. Some of it I learned from his sketchbooks after he disappeared." She paused. "He left 3 of them. My mother kept them in a box in the closet for 12 years. She gave them to me on my 15th birthday." Another pause. "I don't think she expected me to spend the next 3 years learning every mark in them." "Why did you?" Hammer asked. Emma considered the question, not in a way that suggested she didn't know the answer, more like she was deciding how much of the answer to give. "Because he was my father," she finally said, "and because I wanted to understand what he was trying to say. Not just in the paintings, in everything." She looked at the fuel tank. "He built things into his work that most people never saw. I spent 3 years figuring out what they meant. And what I figured out is that I can't answer the rest of my questions from sketchbooks alone." Hammer studied her. "What questions?" "The ones about why he disappeared," Emma said. "Who he was to the people here. What happened on that charity ride 12 years ago?" She looked at him directly. "And why someone named Victor Langley has been trying to purchase my father's remaining artwork from my mother for the past 2 years." The name landed differently than Daniel Parker's had. Daniel Parker's name had spread warmth through the crowd, recognition, nostalgia, grief. Victor Langley's name spread something colder. Hammer's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "From my mother," Emma said. "He's contacted her 4 times in 2 years. He's offering significant money for any original work my father left behind. He claims they had a business arrangement." She paused. "My mother says she never heard my father mention him once." The garage was very quiet. "She didn't sell him anything?" Hammer asked. "No, she stopped returning his calls." Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her. 3 weeks after the last call, someone broke into our apartment. Nothing was taken. The only things disturbed were my father's boxes. Hammer turned to look at Pete Larson. Pete's jaw was set hard. "She's staying here this weekend," Hammer said. It wasn't a question. "That was my hope," Emma said. "We'll find you a room." He picked up the fuel tank, carefully examined the artwork one more time. "And tomorrow morning before the ride, you're going to sit down with me and Pete and some other people, and you're going to tell us everything you know about Victor Langley." He set the tank down. "And we're going to tell you everything we remember about your father." Emma exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "One more thing," Hammer said. "What?" He looked at her steadily. "Your father was one of the most important people this chapter ever had. Not because of the paintings, though God knows those were something. Because of who he was." He paused. "Whatever you came here looking for, you're going to find it. But you're also going to find things you weren't expecting. You understand me?" Emma Parker, standing in a garage full of 93 people, who all somehow knew her face before they knew her name, thought about 11 hours on a Greyhound bus, and 3 years of sketchbooks, in a box in her mother's closet, and a phone that had rung 4 times with a voice her mother refused to trust. "I understand," she said. She didn't. Not yet, but she was about to. That evening, long after the test painting was done and the crowd had dispersed to the bonfire, and the tables of food, and the long, slow conversations that happened when people who'd ridden together for decades hadn't seen each other in months, long after all of that, Emma sat alone in the small room they'd given her and opened her father's 3rd sketchbook to the last page. She'd looked at this page hundreds of times. It was different from every other page in the three book. Not a drawing, not a design study, not a technical reference. Just words written in her father's cramped, leaning hand and a date. The date was 3 days before he disappeared. She had memorized the words long ago, but she read them again now in the quiet of a room in a building her father had known, surrounded by people who had known him. What you build in secret will speak louder than anything you say out loud. The work is the truth. Protect the work. She closed the sketchbook. Outside, someone started an engine and the deep note of it rolled through the walls and into her chest. And for the first time in 12 years, Emma Parker felt something that might have been the beginning of an answer. Pete Larson showed up at Emma's door at 6 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who hadn't slept. She hadn't either. She took the coffee without a word and stepped aside to let him in. He sat down on the only chair in the room. She sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the particular kind that exists between people who are both carrying the same weight from different ends. I knew your father for 19 years, Pete finally said. Rode with him for 14 of those. Watched him paint for all of them. He wrapped both hands around his cup. When you were working on that tank yesterday, I had to walk away. You know why? Because it looked like his work, Emma said. Because it was his work, Pete said. Not similar, not influenced. The exact same hand, the same decisions, the same instincts. He shook his head slowly. I've been doing this a long time. I know what imitation looks like. That wasn't imitation. Emma looked down at her coffee. He used to let me sit beside him when I was little. I don't remember most of it clearly. I was 3-4 years old. But I remember the smell of the paint and the sound of the brushes and watching his hands move. She paused. My mother used to say I absorbed things I didn't even know I was absorbing. She's right, Pete said. That's exactly what happened. He was quiet for a moment. What did she tell you about why he disappeared? That he went on a charity ride and didn't come back. That the police investigated for 6 months, found nothing. That the chapter looked for him for years. Emma lifted her eyes. And that she never believed the official version of what happened. Pete's jaw tightened. Neither did we. The morning meeting Hammer had promised happened in the back office, a room with a long table, too many chairs and walls covered in photographs and maps and the accumulated paperwork of an organization that had been running for decades. 7 people gathered. Emma was the youngest by at least 25 years. Hammer sat at the head of the table. Pete sat to his left. To his right was a woman named Rosa, mid-50s, with sharp eyes and the efficient movements of someone who ran things. She was the chapter's financial officer and had been since before Daniel Parker disappeared. Beside her were 3 senior members whose names Emma recorded carefully, Carl, Jimmy, Bev. And at the far end, saying nothing, just watching, was a man introduced only as Dutch who had apparently been present at every significant event in the chapter's history for the past 35 years and remembered all of them. Tell us about Langley, Hammer said. Everything. Emma laid it out clearly the way she'd organized it in her head over 3 years. Victor Langley, 62 years old, based in Phoenix. Construction and real estate money mostly, but with fingers in several other industries, including event promotion and charitable fundraising. A public profile built around philanthropy, hospital wings, scholarship funds, community programs. The kind of man who got his photograph taken at galas and had his name on buildings. The first contact with her mother had come 2 years ago, a letter on professional stationery offering to purchase any original artwork created by Daniel Parker. The offer was generous, more than generous actually, the kind of number that signaled the buyer wanted something specific and wanted it quietly. Her mother had ignored it. The second and third contacts were phone calls. Polite, persistent, escalating, slightly in urgency each time. Still professional, still offering money, still claiming a prior business arrangement with Daniel that entitled Langley to first consideration on any remaining work. What business arrangement? Rosa asked sharply. He never specified, Emma said. My mother asked directly on the second call. He said it was a private matter that he'd prefer to discuss in person. She paused. She declined. After the fourth contact, she stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. And then someone broke into your apartment, Hammer said. 3 weeks after the last call, late on a Tuesday. My mother was at work, I was at school. Whoever it was got in through the kitchen window, went through 3 specific areas: my father's storage boxes, the desk where my mother keeps paperwork, and my room. Emma's voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened around the coffee cup. They didn't take anything. No electronics, no cash, nothing obvious. Just went through those areas and left. They were looking for something, Rosa said. It wasn't a question. The paintings, Dutch said. It was the first word he'd spoken. Everyone at the table looked at him. He was looking at Emma. Your father's remaining original work. They wanted to know if you had it and where it was. That's what I think, Emma said. What I don't know is why those specific paintings would be worth that level of risk to someone like Langley. The table was quiet. Then Pete said, "Tell her about the charity ride." Hammer looked at Pete for a moment. Then he looked at Emma. "The ride Daniel disappeared from," he said. "It was organized to raise money for veterans' families. 3 days, 4 states, 22 riders. Daniel went with them as the chapter's representative." He stopped. "They raised a significant amount. I won't give you the exact number, but it was substantial corporate donations. Private donors, ticket sales for events along the route. The funds were supposed to go to 2 veterans support organizations." "Supposed to," Emma said. "They went somewhere, but there were questions afterward about how much actually reached the organizations." Hammer's voice was carefully controlled. "The discrepancy was significant enough that some of our people started asking hard questions. Daniel was one of them." He paused. "He disappeared 4 days after he told Pete he had found something he needed to document." Emma sat very still. "He said he needed to document it." "Those were his exact words," Pete said. "I've gone over that conversation in my head 10,000 times. He said, 'Pete, I found something and I need to document it the right way before I do anything else.' I asked him what that meant. He said, 'You know what it means. You know how I document things.'" The room understood what that meant. Emma understood what that meant. Her father documented things the way artists document things. Not in writing, not in files that could be deleted or taken. In paint, in work, hidden in plain sight within images that only someone who knew how to look would be able to read. "Nobody found anything afterward?" Emma asked. "In his studio, in his belongings?" "We went through everything," Rosa said. "His studio had been cleared out. Not robbed, cleared out professionally, carefully. His tools were still there. His reference materials. Everything that was clearly his personal property. But the canvases, the finished and unfinished work, most of it was gone." She paused. "We assumed it had been taken by whoever was responsible. We assumed whatever evidence he documented was gone with it." "Most of it," Emma said carefully. Rosa looked at her. "What do you know?" "I don't know anything yet," Emma said. "But Langley is still looking for something, which means he doesn't have everything." She looked around the table. "Which means whatever my father documented most carefully, the most important thing is still somewhere he hasn't found it." Carl, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. He was 65, the oldest person in the room, and he had the deliberate quality of someone who chose every word. "There's a storage unit," he said. "Old facility out on Route 9, about 12 miles from here. Daniel rented it for years, kept overflow work there. Reference materials, things he wasn't currently using. When he disappeared, we paid the rent on it for 2 years, hoping he'd come back." He glanced at Hammer. "After 2 years, we let it go." "What happened to the contents?" Emma asked. "Facility should have auctioned them," Carl said. "But the owner at the time, old man named Briggs, knew. Now Daniel knew to us. He locked the unit and left it. Wouldn't let anyone touch it." A pause. "Briggs died 4 years ago. His daughter inherited the property. She called us last year asking if we wanted to clear the unit out." Carl looked at Emma steadily. "We hadn't gotten around to it." The room was very still. "Take me there today," Emma said. Hammer looked at her. "The ride leaves tomorrow morning." "After the ride," Emma said. "Oh boy. Or before, whenever you can, but I need to see that unit." Hammer nodded once. "After the ride." The memorial ride left at 9 the next morning. 91 bikes rolling out in formation, the sound of them filling the air for miles before they cleared the county. Emma rode in the support vehicle with Rosa, who spent the first hour of the drive saying nothing, and the second hour asking questions that were really statements in disguise, the kind of probing that accomplished people use when they want to understand someone without appearing to interrogate them. Rosa had known Daniel Parker for 15 years. She talked about him the way people talk about Someone whose absence has left a shape in the room that nothing else has ever quite filled. Precise, specific without sentimentality, but underneath the precision, Emma could hear something that was very close to grief. He used to bring you here sometimes, Rosa said. When you were small, 3, 4 years old, your mother would drop you both off on Saturday mornings, and he'd spend the day working, and you'd sit under the work table drawing on whatever paper he gave you. She glanced sideways at Emma. You don't remember? Not clearly. I remember the feeling of it more than the specific moments. You drew a picture of a dog once and showed it to your father, and he told you the proportions were off in the hind legs, and you cried for about 30 seconds, and then you drew it again. Rosa's voice had something in it. He kept that second drawing. I saw it pinned above his workstation for months. Emma said nothing. She was looking out the window at the passing landscape, but her jaw was tight. He talked about you constantly, Rosa said. What you were learning, what you were curious about, what made you laugh. He used to say you were going to be a better artist than him because you had his eye, but your mother's patience was the thing he had always struggled with. She paused. When he disappeared, it wasn't just losing a brother. It was losing someone who was building something with his daughter. That made it worse. For all of us. Emma turned from the window. Did you believe he was dead? Rosa considered the question seriously. For the first few years, no. We believed he was in danger, hiding that he'd surface when it was safe. After 5 years, most people shifted. After 10, it's hard to hold on to hope for 10 years. She paused. But I never believed he simply fell off a road somewhere and nobody found a trace of him. That story never sat right. It didn't sit right with my mother either. Your mother, Rosa said carefully, is either the strongest woman I've never met or the most stubborn. Daniel used to say she was both. Despite everything, Emma almost smiled. The ride came back in the late afternoon. 91 bikes returning in the same formation they'd left in, and there was something about watching them come back, the precision of it, the collective weight of all those years of shared road that hit Emma somewhere she hadn't expected. These were the people her father had chosen, not born to them, not assigned to them, chosen them and been chosen back. And they had held his memory for 12 years with the kind of fidelity that most people never inspired in anyone. She thought about the words in the sketchbook. What you build in secret will speak louder than anything you say out loud. He had built something in secret, and it had waited 12 years for someone with his eyes to come find it. Hammer found her after the ride wound down, while people were still milling and the noise hadn't fully settled. You ready, he said. She was. Mom. The storage facility on Route 9 was the kind of place that accumulated time visibly, a long row of metal door units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of property that asked no questions and answered none. The unit was near the back number 14 with a padlock that had been there long enough that the metal had taken on the color of the surrounding air. Carl was there with a key. He'd had it for 4 years since Briggs's daughter had called. He hadn't used it yet. Emma watched his face as he approached the door, the particular expression of a man about to open something he'd been keeping closed. The door rolled up. The smell of old paint and turpentine hit Emma first, so familiar it was almost physical. The smell of her father's studio that she remembered in her body rather than her mind. She stood in the entrance and breathed it in and didn't move for a moment. Take your time, Hammer said quietly beside her. She stepped inside. The unit was densely stacked, years of a working artist's overflow, organized with the particular logic of someone who knew exactly where everything was and expected to come back for it. Reference book supply boxes, wooden crates sealed with hardware cloth, and along the back wall, stacked in flat storage racks, canvases. Dozens of them. Emma moved through the space methodically, the way her father had taught her to assess a collection, not grabbing, not rushing, reading the surfaces for information before touching anything. Most of the canvases were work she recognized from descriptions in his sketchbooks, studies, experiments, work in progress. She was halfway through the 4th rack when she stopped. Her hand was resting on the edge of a canvas that felt different, heavier, rolled rather than stretched and wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth that had been tied with the particular double knot her father used for work he wanted to protect from humidity. She looked at it for a long moment without moving. What is it? Pete said from behind her. I don't know yet, Emma said. She carefully moved the surrounding canvases to give herself room and lifted the wrapped roll free of the rack. It was large, roughly 5 feet. When she set it upright, the weight of serious canvas in serious paint. She untied the oilcloth with steady hands, though her heart was not steady, and unwrapped it slowly. She had to clear a space on the floor to unroll it. Hammer and Pete and Carl stood behind her, and the four of them watched the painting reveal itself in sections as the canvas unrolled. At first, it looked like an accident scene. A motorcycle crash rendered in Daniel Parker's unmistakable hand, the dark expressionism he used for serious work, the way he made paint carry emotional weight that had nothing to do with beauty. The scene was chaotic, violent, real in the way that only first-hand witness creates. And then the faces. Emma stopped unrolling. In the center of the canvas, among the chaos of the crash scene, Daniel had painted 3 faces with photographic clarity. Not impressionistic, not abstracted portrait-level accuracy, the kind that could only come from someone who had seen those faces clearly and remembered them exactly. One of those faces Emma had never seen before. One of them she had seen on the television news during a Phoenix charity gala 6 months ago. One of them she had seen on professional stationery at the top of a letter her mother had showed her 2 years ago. Victor Langley. Her hands were shaking. She made herself finish unrolling the canvas. The lower section of the painting was different from the upper. Not the crash scene, but something denser layered the kind of visual complexity her father used when he was building information into work. Dates rendered as part of the design. Numbers worked into the border. And text, actual text, small and precise, woven into the negative space of the composition in a way that required knowing it was there to find it. Emma leaned close and began to read. She read for a long time. Behind her, nobody spoke. When she finally sat back on her heels, the unit was very quiet. She could hear the distant sound of the highway, the settling of the metal walls around them. "What does it say?" Hammer asked. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had been waiting 12 years for this moment and was now trying not to break it with the wrong word. Emma looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. She had decided somewhere in the past 3 minutes that she was not going to fall apart in this unit, that she was going to hold herself together long enough to say what needed to be said. "My father didn't disappear," she said. "He was run off the road. The crash in this painting, this is the crash. He survived it, at least initially, and he had enough time to document what he'd found." She looked back at the canvas, the charity funds he traced where they went. Langley was running a diversion scheme through the fundraising events, pulling money into shell accounts before it reached the veterans organizations. "My father figured out the mechanism, got documentation of specific transactions, and hid it in this painting." She paused. "And the 3 faces in the scene, these are the 3 men who ran him off the road." The silence in the unit was absolute. "One of them is Victor Langley," Pete said. He'd been reading over her shoulder. "One of them is Victor Langley," Emma confirmed. Carl had his phone out. His hands were completely still. "I'm calling the attorney," he said. Hammer was looking at the canvas with an expression that Emma had no name for: grief and fury, and something that looked like resolution, all of it at once, none of it canceling the others out. He looked at Emma, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Your father knew someone would find this eventually," he said. "He built it so that the right person would find it." Emma looked at the painting, at the faces her father had recorded with his artist's precision, at the hidden text he'd woven into the composition, at the 12 years of patience encoded in oil and canvas. "He built it for me," she said. "He just didn't know it would take this long." Outside the storage unit, the sun was going down over the Arizona desert, and somewhere on a highway 12 years in the past, a man who had known someone who would come looking had left the most important thing he ever painted in the only safe place he could think of. His daughter was home. Carl made 3 phone calls in the parking lot of that storage facility, and by the time he finished the 3rd one, the temperature of everything had changed. The chapter's attorney was a man named Gerald Hoyt, 60 years old, former federal prosecutor, the kind of lawyer who had seen enough of the world that almost nothing surprised him anymore. Almost. When Carl described the contents of the rolled canvas, Hoyt went quiet for long enough that Carl had to ask if he was still on the line. "I'm here," Hoyt said. "Don't touch anything else in that unit. Don't photograph the canvas on personal devices. Don't discuss the specifics outside of people you trust completely." A pause. "I'll be there by tomorrow morning." Carl relayed this to the group standing around the open unit. Nobody argued. Hammer had the padlock back on the door within 10 minutes, and they drove back to the clubhouse in the kind of silence that follows moments when the shape of a situation has permanently changed. Emma sat in the backseat of Hammer's truck and held herself very still. Her hands were in her lap. She wasn't looking out the window. She was doing the thing she did when she needed to process something too large to process quickly. She was sorting it the way her father had taught her to sort a complex composition, breaking it into components, understanding each piece before trying to see the whole. Her father had been murdered. That was the piece she kept returning to. Not disappeared, not lost, murdered or as close to it as made no practical difference by men who needed the evidence he'd gathered to stay hidden. He had survived the crash long enough to reach the storage unit she was certain of, that now reading the timeline he'd encoded in the painting, and he had left everything behind in the most durable form he knew. And then he had not survived whatever came after. She didn't cry. She had done her crying in private in stages over 3 years of slowly understanding what the sketchbooks were telling her. What she felt now was something different, harder and quieter and more purposeful. When they got back to the clubhouse, Hammer sat down next to her at the long table in the main room and said, "Are you all right?" "I need to call my mother," Emma said. He nodded and gave her space. She walked outside and dined, and her mother picked up on the second ring, the particular quick pickup that meant she'd been waiting. "Mom," Emma said. "Emma!" Her mother's voice was tight. "Where are you? You told me you were going to a friend's. I called Sarah, and you weren't." "I'm at the chapter in Arizona," Emma said. "I'm safe. I'm with people who knew Dad." Silence. "Mom." "I'm here," her mother said. The tightness in her voice had shifted into something more complex. "Tell me," Emma told her. Not everything, not the details that Hoyt had said to keep close, but the shape of it. The storage unit, the painting, what the painting documented, what the painting proved. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Emma finished, there was a long pause. "He knew," her mother finally said. Her voice was very quiet. "He knew what he'd found was dangerous. The week before the ride, he was different. Careful. He kept saying things like he was checking off items in his head." Her voice broke slightly on the last word and then steadied. "He told me once I think I always knew what he meant and refused to think about it directly. He said that some things had to be said the right way to last long enough. I didn't know what he meant." "He meant the paintings," Emma said. "Yes," a pause. "Emma, be careful. Langley has resources and he's been patient for 12 years. A man who waits 12 years for something isn't going to give up because an 18-year-old girl found it first." "I know," Emma said. "I mean it. Don't be heroic. Let the people around you help you." Emma looked back at the lit windows of the clubhouse at the silhouettes of people moving inside. "I think I have the right people around me," she said. "Your father thought so too," her mother said softly. "He was right about that, at least." After she hung up, Emma stood outside for a few minutes, and the night air of the Arizona desert pressed against her, warm and dry and indifferent, and she thought about a man who had built his most important truth into a painting and hidden it in a storage unit 12 miles from the people who would eventually help his daughter understand it. She went back inside. Gerald Hoyt arrived at 7 the next morning in a charcoal gray suit that looked aggressively out of place in the clubhouse parking lot. He was compact, precise, with silver-rimmed glasses and the careful eyes of someone who read everything, including people, before responding. He shook Emma's hand with both of his and held it for a moment. "Your father," he said, "was one of the most principled people I ever met. I want you to know that before we start." "You knew him?" Emma asked, surprised. "He did some artwork for my daughter's quinceañera years ago," Hoyt said. "We had dinner a few times after that. He never told me what he was documenting. I wish he had, but I always knew he was someone who took evidence seriously." He released her hand. "Let's go look at this painting." They went back to the unit with a professional photographer Hoyt had brought, a forensic art consultant named Dr. Yi, who worked primarily with insurance companies and courts, and 2 people from a law firm Hoyt had contacted the night before. The canvas was unrolled on a clean tarp laid on the concrete floor, and Dr. Yi spent 90 minutes examining it in the particular focused silence of an expert doing serious work. Emma stood to one side and watched. Hammer stood next to her, arms crossed, not talking, which she had come to understand was his way of being present. When Dr. Yi finally straightened up, she looked at Hoyt over her glasses. "The paint chemistry is consistent with the period," she said. "I can confirm with lab analysis, but the aging signatures are right for something done 12 to 14 years ago. The embedded text is original to the painting, not added later. It's under the final glazing layer. She paused. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The text is protected. It's inside the work, not on top of it. Can it be read in full? Hoyt asked. With enhancement, yes. Most of it is already legible to the naked eye if you know to look for it. The dates and the numbers in the border work are clear. The text passages require magnification in a few places, but are intact. She looked at Emma. Did your father have a background in documentation, legal or forensic? Not formally, Emma said, but he was meticulous. He believed that if something was worth recording, it was worth recording correctly. Dr. Yi nodded slowly. He recorded this correctly. Hoyt turned to Emma. Here's where we are. The painting constitutes physical evidence of witness testimony. Your father was documenting what he observed. The financial data encoded in the work correlates with public records we can already pull, showing discrepancies in the charity fund distributions from that period. The faces in the crash scene combined with the timeline he documented give investigators specific individuals in a specific sequence of events to examine. He paused. This is not nothing. This is significant. Is it enough? Emma asked. It's enough to reopen the investigation into your father's disappearance. It's enough to initiate an inquiry into Langley's financial activities from that period. Whether it's enough for prosecution depends on what investigators find when they start pulling threads. He looked at her steadily. But Emma, this is 12-year-old evidence. Langley has had 12 years to cover his tracks. This is a beginning, not an ending. Emma absorbed that. What do we do now? Now, Hoyt said, we do this the right way, completely by the book, so that nothing Langley's attorneys can say later undermines the integrity of what your father left behind. He looked at Hammer, and now Victor Langley finds out he's been looking in the wrong places for 12 years. What happened next happened fast, and then slower, and then fast again, the rhythm of legal and institutional processes that Emma had no previous experience with and had to learn on the fly while simultaneously dealing with everything else. Within 48 hours of Hoyt's examination, two things happened that changed the temperature again. First, a forensic accounting firm Hoyt retained pulled 3 years of public financial records related to the charity events Langley had organized during that period and found irregularities significant enough that their preliminary report used the word systematic. Second, a retired state investigator named Ray Bowen, who had worked the original case of Daniel Parker's disappearance and had always believed the official closure was premature, called Hoyt's office the morning after Hoyt reached out to him. I kept a personal file, Bowen said when Hoyt put him on speaker, in the clubhouse office with Emma and Hammer present. When a case gets closed in a way that doesn't sit right, you keep a file. I've had the Parker file in my garage for 11 years. His voice was the voice of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. There was a witness, a gas station attendant on Route 9 who told us he saw a motorcycle go off the road and saw a second vehicle, a dark SUV, stop and then leave fast. His statement was in the initial report, and then it wasn't. Someone pulled it. The room went very still. Someone pulled the witness statement from the official record, Hammer said. Not a question. From the official record, Bowen confirmed. I kept my own copy. I always kept my own copy. A pause. The witness's description of the SUV make partial plate matches a vehicle registered to a holding company that Langley used during that period. Another pause. I know what it looks like. I've known for 11 years. Emma felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with physics. Her father hadn't just been killed because he'd found evidence. He'd been killed, and then the evidence of his killing had been buried, and the man responsible had spent 12 years attending charity galas and having his name put on buildings. She pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed. Mr. Bowen, she said, her voice was completely steady. I want to thank you for keeping that file. A long pause from the other end of the line. Miss Parker, I'm sorry it took this long for it to matter, Bowen said. I'm sorry I couldn't do more when it would have made a difference. You kept the truth, Emma said. That made a difference. My father would have understood that. After the call ended, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Hammer said, Langley's going to find out we have the painting. It's not a question of if. How soon, Emma asked. Depends on who he has watching, Hammer said. Could be days, could be sooner. He looked at her. He's going to move. Men like him move when they feel the ground shifting. He's going to try to discredit the painting, discredit you, discredit the whole chain of custody. Let him try, Emma said. Emma, I mean it, she said. Let him try. My father built that painting to survive exactly that kind of attack. He built it to be authenticated. He built it to be read by someone who understood what they were looking at. She looked at Hammer. Dr. Yi understands what she's looking at. Hoyt understands the law. Bowen has a witness statement that was buried and survived anyway. She paused. Dad spent the last hours of his life making sure the truth was harder to kill than he was. The least I can do is trust the work he left. Hammer looked at her for a long time. You sound like him, he said quietly. Good, Emma said. She meant it. Dope. Victor Langley's first move came 2 days later, faster than anyone had expected. Not legal, not direct. Langley was too careful for that. Instead, a reporter from a Phoenix entertainment blog published a short piece questioning whether the newly surfaced artwork attributed to the late Daniel Parker was genuine, citing sources close to the art community who doubted that a teenage girl with no formal credentials could have accurately identified and authenticated complex fine art. The piece was casual, dismissive, and precisely calibrated the kind of thing that wasn't worth responding to directly, but planted just enough doubt to be useful later. Emma read it on her phone sitting in the clubhouse kitchen. Rosa was across the table watching her. He's testing how you respond, Rosa said. I know, Emma said. She set the phone down. He wants me reactive. He wants me to make a public statement, get emotional, give him something to use. What are you going to do? Emma thought about it. Nothing, not yet. She looked at Rosa. What do you know about his public reputation? The charity work specifically. Rosa's eyes sharpened. Why? Because if we go into a courtroom with a 12-year-old painting and a reopened investigation, Langley's defense is going to be reputation, community standing, philanthropy. He's going to say my father was unstable, that the painting is the obsessive work of a troubled man, that any financial irregularities were bookkeeping errors that have long since been corrected. Emma paused. We need more than the painting. We need the pattern. How many charity events did he run? How many had questions about fund distribution afterward? How many times did the questions get buried? Rosa was quiet. Then she said, give me 24 hours. Take what you need, Emma said. Rosa was back in 18. What she'd found, working with 2 other chapter members and a contact at a nonprofit watchdog organization, was not a single incident. It was a methodology, the same structure repeated across 6 different charity events over 14 years. Each one with a different name, different beneficiaries, different public profile, but the same underlying mechanism. Money raised, money diverted, organizations receiving less than publicly announced discrepancies, resolved quietly or not resolved at all. The total amount was not a rounding error. It was a number that, written down and looked at directly, made everyone in the room go silent. The veterans' families from the ride where Daniel Parker disappeared had received less than 40% of what had been publicly announced. Emma looked at that number for a long time. She thought about her father on that charity ride, talking to veterans' families, watching the donations come in, understanding over the course of 3 days what was happening to money that men and women who had served their country were depending on. She thought about him deciding he couldn't look away from it, deciding he had to document it, deciding that the right way to document it was the way he knew best. She thought about him in that storage unit, injured, running out of time, rolling a canvas as carefully as he could, and wrapping it twice and tying it with the double knot he always used for work he needed to survive. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Hoyt, she said. I'll call him, Rosa said. Tell him we have the pattern, Emma said. Tell him it goes back 14 years and crosses state lines. She looked up. Tell him it's time to stop being careful and start being loud. Rosa picked up her phone. And in that moment, 12 years after a man had hidden the truth in the most durable place he could think of, his daughter started the process of making it impossible to hide. Langley's second move came 2 days after that, and this one wasn't casual. His attorneys filed a civil claim asserting that the artwork in the storage unit constituted property subject to a contractual agreement between Victor Langley Enterprises and Daniel Parker, dating to a commission arrangement 12 years prior. The filing claimed the painting was created as part of that arrangement, and therefore ownership reverted to Langley upon the artist's death. The claim was elegant. The kind of legal maneuver that was designed not necessarily to win, but to delay, to complicate, to give the impression of legitimate dispute where there was none. It was also, Emma recognized immediately, a mistake. He just put himself in court, Hoyt said when he called Emma with the news. She could hear something in his voice that sounded very much like satisfaction. He's claiming a business relationship with your father. He's going to have to document that relationship. He's going to have to provide evidence of this commission arrangement. A pause. And when he can't because it didn't exist, the question becomes why he's claiming one. He panicked, Hammer said. He was sitting across from Emma in the office. He heard about Bowen's witness statement and he panicked. Men like that panic quietly, Emma said. This isn't panic. This is him thinking he can still win on paper. She looked at Hoyt's number on her phone. He doesn't know what we have from Rosa. He doesn't know about the 14-year pattern. He thinks this is still about one painting. She called Hoyt back. Gerald, she said, when you respond to that filing, I want the 14-year financial pattern in the response. All 6 events, but all 6 discrepancies. Full documentation from the watchdog organization. She paused. I want it public record before he realizes how much we found. Hoyt was quiet for a moment. That's aggressive. My father was aggressive when he had to be, Emma said. He didn't run from what he found. He documented it. She paused. I'm his daughter. Another pause. I'll have the response filed by end of week, Hoyt said. After she hung up, Hammer looked at her across the table. His expression was the one she'd come to recognize, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. He thought you were going to be easy, Hammer said. He thought I was an 18-year-old girl with a sketchbook, Emma said. Same mistake they all made day one, Hammer said. Emma thought of the garage, the laughter, the 90 seconds of noise, before she'd opened the sketchbook and the room had gone quiet. Yes, she said. It is. Hoyt filed the response on a Thursday, and by Friday morning, Victor Langley's attorneys had gone quiet in a way that was louder than anything they'd said before. Emma knew what that silence meant. She'd watched enough of her mother's difficult situations resolve or not resolve to understand that when the other side stops talking publicly, they're talking privately at a very high volume. Langley was regrouping. He was reading the 14-year financial pattern that Hoyt had entered into public record, and he was understanding for the first time the full shape of what had been assembled against him. She was eating breakfast in the clubhouse kitchen when Hammer came in and set his phone on the table in front of her. He hired Marcus Webb, Hammer said. Emma looked at the name on the screen. Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb Carver, in Associates Phoenix's most prominent civil litigation firm, the kind of attorney whose involvement in a case was itself a statement. His client list included 2 governors, a senator, and a Fortune 500 company that had successfully buried an environmental liability case that should have cost them hundreds of millions. He's not trying to settle, Emma said. No, Hammer said. He's going to war. She set down her coffee cup. Good. Hammer looked at her. Emma Webb is very good at what he does. His strategy is going to be destruction. Not of the painting, not of the evidence of you, of your credibility, your motives, your relationship to your father. He's going to make this about whether an 18-year-old girl with no formal training and an obvious emotional investment can be trusted as the source of a 12-year-old canvas that conveniently implicates a prominent community figure. He paused. He's going to be brutal. I know, Emma said. You've never been in a courtroom. My father never ran from what he found, Emma said. He documented it and trusted that the truth was harder to kill than the people trying to bury it. She looked at Hammer steadily. I'm not running. Hammer studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Emma didn't know who he called first. Later, she would find out he made 11 calls that morning before 9 o'clock. Every one of them was to a chapter officer, a senior member, or a long-term brother who had known Daniel Parker. Every call was brief. Every call ended with the same 2 words. We're in. Gerald Hoyt held a strategy meeting 2 days later in a conference room at his firm. Emma sat at the table with Hammer, Pete, Rosa, Carl, Dutch, and Ray Bowen, who had driven 4 hours to be present. Also present were Dr. Yee, the forensic accounting firm's lead analyst, a quiet, methodical woman named Sandra Chu, who communicated exclusively in facts and had the effect of making every room she entered feel more serious, and two attorneys from the Veterans Advocacy Organization that had been one of the intended recipients of the diverted charity funds. That last edition had been Rose's idea, and it was the one that changed the character of everything. Because the moment the Veterans Organization entered the picture, this stopped being a story about one painting and one man's disappearance and became something significantly larger. The organization has standing, one of their attorneys said. She was mid-40s, direct with the compressed energy of someone who had been fighting underfunded battles for a long time and had learned to be efficient about it. The funds diverted from their allocation over 6 events represent a quantifiable harm. We can join the civil action, which changes the scope of what Langley's attorneys are looking at and significantly expands the discovery process. Meaning, Emma asked. Meaning we can compel financial records going back 14 years. Not just the charity events, the full structure of the entities Langley used to move the money. Every shell company, every holding account, every transfer. She paused. What your father documented was the skeleton. Discovery builds the body around it. Hoyt nodded. Webb is going to try to narrow the scope of the case as much as possible. Keep it focused on the painting's authenticity and Emma's credibility. We expand the scope every time he tries to narrow it. We make this about the full 14-year pattern every time he makes it about one canvas. He'll claim delay, Webb's strategy being anticipated by Hoyt. He'll say 14-year-old financial matters are beyond the statute of limitations. Criminal fraud has no statute of limitations in this state when the fraud is ongoing, the veteran's attorney said flatly. And the most recent event we've documented was 4 years ago. She let that land. He didn't stop. He slowed down, but he didn't stop. The room absorbed that. Emma looked at Sandra Chu. Is that confirmed? Confirmed and documented, Chu said. The 4th event in the pattern is 18 months ago, small compared to the earlier ones. But the mechanism is identical. She paused. Either he believed he was completely safe or he couldn't stop. Possibly both. Emma thought about a man who had attended charity galas for 12 years and had his name on buildings and had called her mother 4 times and had broken into their apartment and had never not once stopped. She thought about what that kind of certainty cost and what it revealed about the person carrying it. He thought my father's evidence died with him, Emma said. Yes, Hoyt said. And when my mother started getting calls, he assumed she had something but didn't know what she had. That's the logical reading. He thought he had time, Emma said. He thought he could acquire the paintings, quietly eliminate the evidence, and keep going. She looked around the table. He didn't know about the storage unit. Nobody knew about the storage unit except Carl, Hammer said. And Carl never told anyone what was in it because Carl never opened it. Carl, for his part, said nothing. His jaw was tight in the particular way of a man who was carrying something heavy and choosing not to put it down yet. Carl, Emma said quietly. He looked at her. You kept the key for 4 years, she said. You kept the rent paid for 2 years before that. You didn't let anyone touch it. She paused. You were waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for, Carl said. His voice was rough. I just knew that unit was Daniel's, and it wasn't right to let it go. He looked down at his hands. Turns out I was waiting for you. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hoyt cleared his throat gently and brought the meeting back to the work that needed doing, because that was what Gerald Hoyt did, and because the work was the only way through. Marcus Webb's first major move came 8 days after Langley retained him, and it was exactly what Hammer had predicted, precise, sophisticated, and aimed directly at Emma. Webb filed a motion challenging the chain of custody of the painting and simultaneously released a statement to several Phoenix media outlets describing Emma Parker as a grieving young woman with understandable but misplaced emotional motivations, who had arrived at a private organization's property under false pretenses, accessed a storage facility without authorization, and now seeks to use unverified artwork to make serious accusations against a respected community leader. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and contained no specific legal argument. It was entirely designed to shape a narrative before the facts could be established. Emma read it twice, then called Hoyt. I want to respond, she said. Emma, not publicly, not to the media. She paused. I want to paint. Hoyt was quiet for a beat. What? I want to demonstrate formally and on record that I can produce work consistent with my father's authenticated style. Not to prove ownership, Dr. Yi has that. To destroy the premise that my identification of his techniques is emotional guesswork. Her voice was even. Webb's argument rests on the idea that I can't reliably recognize my father's work. I want to remove that argument before it reaches a judge. Hoyt was quiet for a moment. That's smart. My father taught me to build arguments you can hold in your hands, Emma said. Let me build this one. 2 days later, in the presence of Dr. Yi, two additional forensic art consultants retained by Hoyt and a notary, Emma Parker, sat down at a work table in the chapter's garage and painted. She worked for 4 hours. She produced two pieces, one in her own developing style, distinct and personal, and one executed in deliberate, faithful reproduction of her father's documented techniques, using the same methods, the same hidden structural choices, the same embedded signatures that Dr. Yi had cataloged from the storage unit canvas. The three consultants examined both pieces for 90 minutes afterward. Their consensus was unambiguous. The second piece demonstrated not merely familiarity with Daniel Parker's methods, but deep structural understanding of them, the kind of knowledge that could only come from years of direct instruction and study. It was not forgery, it was inheritance. Webb loses the credibility argument, Hoyt said when he reviewed the consultant's preliminary findings that evening. He can't claim you don't know what you're looking at. The record now shows you absolutely know what you're looking at. He paused. He's going to pivot to something else. I don't know what yet. I do, Emma said. Oh, he's going to go after the chapter, Emma said. He's going to argue that Hammer and the others influenced my identification, that the environment I was brought into was inherently biased, that 90 people who love my father aren't capable of objective assessment of evidence connected to his death. She paused. It's the only move he has left that doesn't require him to directly attack the painting's authenticity, which he can't do because Dr. Yi's analysis is bulletproof. Hoyt was quiet. That's a reasonable prediction. It's what I'd do if I were him and desperate, Emma said. You think he's desperate? Emma thought about 14 years of carefully constructed public philanthropy. She thought about 4 phone calls to her mother and a broken window and a dark SUV on Route 9 12 years ago. He's been desperate since the moment my father decided not to look away, she said. He just got very good at not showing it. Webb's pivot came exactly as Emma had anticipated, and it came with a speed that confirmed Hoyt's read that Langley was operating from something close to panic, dressed as strategy. The new filing argued that the so-called evidence had been handled, interpreted, and promoted exclusively by members of an organization with a documented adversarial history whose interest in implicating Victor Langley was not evidentiary but personal and retaliatory. It named Hammer specifically. It named Pete. It made careful reference to the chapter's history in a way that was legally precise and publicly damaging, not alleging specific crimes, just invoking associations, letting the reader's assumptions do the work. Emma was in the main room when Hammer read the filing on his phone. She watched his face. He read it without expression, the same way he'd read everything completely from beginning to end before deciding what he thought. When he finished, he set the phone down on the table and looked at her. He named you too, Hammer said. At the end, as someone who came to this property seeking the chapter's support for a personal grievance. I know, Emma said. She'd read it on Hoyt's forwarded copy 30 minutes earlier. He's trying to make us look like we manufactured this. He's trying to make the jury or the judge or the public, whoever's listening, see 90 bikers and an emotional teenager instead of witnesses and evidence, Emma said. He's betting that the picture in people's heads is louder than the facts. Hammer was quiet. He's wrong, Emma said, and I want to show him why. She looked around the room at the people who happened to be there. Pete, Rosa, Carl Dutch, Deke, and 6 or 7 others she'd come to know over the past weeks. People who had ridden together for decades, who had kept a storage unit locked out of loyalty, who had kept a key for 4 years because letting go didn't feel right. I want every person in this chapter who knew my father to be willing to testify, she said. Not about the painting, about him, who he was, what he stood for, why they trusted him. I want the court to see that the people vouching for this evidence aren't a gang with a grudge, they're witnesses to a man's character. She paused. Webb wants the jury to see a stereotype. I want them to see the truth. That's asking a lot, Pete said carefully. Some of our people don't love courtrooms. I know, Emma said. I'm asking anyway. She looked at Hammer. He looked back at her for a long moment, the same steady assessment he'd given her in the garage on the first day when she'd been a skinny 18-year-old with a sketchbook and a question and nothing else. Then he said, "I'll talk to everyone." It took 4 days. Not because people were reluctant, that was what surprised Emma. It took 4 days because there were a lot of people and Hammer was thorough, and he wanted every single person who agreed to testify to understand exactly what they were agreeing to and exactly how Webb's attorneys would approach them. He wasn't asking for heroes. He was asking for witnesses who understood what witnessing cost. By the end of the 4th day, he had 47 yes answers. Not 90, not everyone, but 47 people who had known Daniel Parker in different ways and different capacities and were willing to stand in front of a court and say so. Emma heard the number and had to leave the room for a few minutes. When she came back, her eyes were dry, but Pete was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had been watching her for weeks and had started to understand her the way you understand people when you spend enough time paying attention. "He'd be proud of you," Pete said quietly. "I want you to know that." "I hope so," Emma said. "I know so," Pete said, "because what you're doing the way you're doing it, it's exactly what he would have done. He always said that the answer to a lie is never louder noise. It's cleaner truth." He paused. "You're building cleaner truth, every day, piece by piece. That's him. That's exactly him in you." Emma sat with that for a moment. "Pete," she said, "the Saturday mornings when he used to bring me here. When I was little. You were here for those, most of them," Pete said. "What was he like on those mornings specifically? Not the artist, not the chapter member." She paused. "The father." Pete looked at her for a long time. His eyes were soft in the way that old grief makes eyes soft when something finally gives it permission to surface. "He was the most present person I've ever seen with a child," Pete said slowly. "Some people are with their kids, and you can tell a part of them is somewhere else, not him. When you were there, everything else stopped. He'd be in the middle of a complex piece of work, and you'd wander over and touch something, and instead of getting frustrated, he'd just stop. Explain it, show you, watch your face while you tried to understand it." He paused. "He used to say watching you learn something was better than finishing the work." Emma's jaw was tight. "He used to say you were going to do something with it that he hadn't imagined yet," Pete said. "He didn't know what it was, but he was certain." She pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her, the same gesture she'd been making for weeks when things became too large to hold any other way. "He was right," she said quietly. "He just didn't know it was going to be this." Shyam. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 6 weeks after Emma had walked into the garage with a sketchbook and a box of paintbrushes. The night before, she sat at the work table in the garage alone, the same bench where she'd done the test painting, where 93 people had watched her hands move and gone quiet, and she painted. Not for evidence, not for the court, not for anyone who would ever see it. She painted her father's hands. From memory, from the impression of them she'd carried since she was 4 years old. Large, capable hands, paint-stained at the knuckles, holding a brush with the particular relaxed confidence of someone who had made peace with their instrument long ago. She worked for 3 hours. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she'd made. It was the best thing she'd ever painted. Not technically, she'd done more technically demanding work, but in terms of what it carried, what it held, what it said about the person looking at it and the person being looked at, it was the best thing she'd ever made. She carefully set it aside to dry. Then she went to bed because tomorrow was going to be a long day, and Daniel Parker had taught her that rest was part of the work, and she was in every way that mattered her father's daughter. The courthouse parking lot at 7:30 in the morning was quiet. Hoyt was already inside with his team. The Veterans Organization attorneys were meeting in a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Ray Bowen had driven up the night before and was staying at a motel on the edge of town. Emma arrived with Hammer and Pete and Rosa in Hammer's truck. When they walked into the courthouse, the man at the security desk looked at Hammer, took in the vest, the patches, the silver hair, and then looked at Emma and then looked back at the parking lot behind them. Because the parking lot was filling up. 47 motorcycles arriving in groups of 3 and 4 and 5, pulling into the courthouse parking lot with the unhurried precision of people who had ridden together for decades and knew how to arrive somewhere with collective weight. Not loud, not aggressive, not a demonstration, just people who had known Daniel Parker coming to say so. The security guard looked at Hammer. "They're with her," Hammer said, nodding toward Emma. Emma walked through the metal detector and straightened her jacket and looked at the hallway ahead of her. Somewhere in this building, Victor Langley and Marcus Webb were preparing to argue that the truth her father had hidden in a rolled canvas was too old, too complicated, and too connected to unreliable sources to deserve the court's serious attention. She thought of her father's words in the sketchbook. "What you build in secret will speak louder than anything you say out loud. The work is the truth. Protect the work." She had protected it. Now it was time to let it speak. The preliminary hearing lasted 4 hours, and Marcus Webb was very good at his job. Emma had expected that. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the particular quality of his skill, the way he moved through the courtroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who had won so many times that losing had become theoretically possible but practically abstract. He challenged the chain of custody on the painting with surgical precision. He questioned Dr. Yee's methodology with the kind of targeted technical knowledge that required serious preparation. He made the 14-year financial pattern sound like coincidence stacked on coincidence, each layer individually explainable, the whole thing explicable as the confirmation bias of people who had already decided what they wanted to find. He was professional, controlled, and completely effective at making complexity feel like doubt. Emma sat beside Hoyt and watched and kept her face still and her hands flat on the table in front of her, and did not look at Langley, who sat 15 feet away with the composed expression of a man who had survived difficult rooms before and expected to survive this one. When Webb finished his opening argument, Hoyt leaned close to Emma and said quietly, "He's good." "I know," Emma said. "Still want to do this?" She looked at him. "Did my father stop when it got hard?" Hoyt straightened up and began his response. What Hoyt did over the next 90 minutes was not dramatic. It was methodical, relentless, and airtight. He walked the judge through the forensic authentication timeline with Dr. Yee's analysis as the foundation, then built Sandra Chu's 14-year financial documentation on top of it, then placed Ray Bowen's recovered witness statement at the precise point in the timeline where it did the most damage, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a logical conclusion, the piece that completed a picture already 3/4 assembled. He did not raise his voice once. Webb objected 6 times. The judge sustained 2, overruled 4. When Hoyt sat down, the courtroom was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet at the beginning. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Carolyn Marsh, who had the particular expression of someone who had been doing this work long enough to recognize the difference between a complicated case and a case someone was trying to make complicated, looked at her notes for a long moment before speaking. "I'm going to allow the civil claim to proceed," she said. "I'm also referring the financial documentation to the State Attorney General's office for review. That's not a determination of guilt. It's an acknowledgement that what's been presented today warrants serious examination by the appropriate authorities." She looked at Webb. "Counsel, your client's ownership claim will be heard on its merits. I'd suggest those merits be substantial." She adjourned the hearing. Webb was already on his phone before he cleared the courtroom door. Langley followed him without looking at anyone, not at Hoyt, not at Emma, not at the 47 people filling the benches behind the bar. He kept his eyes forward, and his pace steady, and his expression neutral, the face of a man performing composure. But Emma had her father's eyes, and what she saw in the half-second when Langley passed the defense table, and his gaze skipped involuntarily toward the canvas photographs in Hoyt's case files, what she saw was not composure. It was fear. She let out a slow breath and felt something release in her chest that had been coiled there for weeks. "That's not over," Hoyt said beside her. "I know," Emma said, "but it's different now." "Very different," Hoyt said, and he almost smiled.
So what they said.
The Attorney General's office moved faster than anyone expected. That was the first surprise. The second was why. Hoyt called Emma 3 days after the hearing with news she hadn't anticipated. The AG's office had independently and prior to any referral been conducting a preliminary inquiry into Langley's charitable organizations following an unrelated tip from a financial regulator 18 months earlier. The inquiry had stalled for lack of specific documentation. Sandra Chu's 14-year pattern analysis entered into court record and therefore public had provided exactly the framework their investigators needed to understand what they were already looking at. They weren't starting from zero, Hoyt said. They were starting from halfway and didn't know it. We gave them the map. My father gave them the map, Emma said. Yes, Hoyt said. He did. The third surprise came from a direction nobody had seen coming. One of the three men whose faces Daniel Parker had painted into the crash scene, not Langley, one of the others contacted Hoyt's office through a private attorney 4 days after the AG referral became public knowledge. He was 61 years old, had been living under a different name in New Mexico for 9 years, and had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of moment with the particular exhausted readiness of someone who has been carrying a secret so long that the prospect of putting it down feels more like relief than surrender. He wanted to talk. Hoyt called Emma immediately. He's willing to provide a full statement. The crash, the planning before it, the conversations with Langley, everything. His voice was careful. Emma, this is the testimony that makes the criminal case, not just the civil claim, actual criminal prosecution. If what he's offering is what he says it is, when, Emma said. He wants to meet next week. Neutral location, his attorney present, ours present. Preliminary conversation to establish scope before anything formal. Emma was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about 12 years, about her mother's face when she'd called from Arizona, about a storage unit on Route 9 that had been locked since before she was old enough to understand why. Tell him yes, she said. And tell him my father documented what happened because he believed the truth was worth protecting, regardless of the cost. She paused. If this man has been carrying this for 12 years, he already knows that cost. He doesn't need a lecture from me. Hoyt was quiet for a beat. You're sure? I'm sure, Emma said. The meeting happened on a Tuesday in a conference room in Flagstaff Neutral Ground, halfway between everything. The man's name, his real name, was Thomas Guidry. He was thin gray with the careful movements of someone who had been living carefully for a long time. He sat across from Emma and looked at her and then looked away and then looked back, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of something that had been compressed under pressure for so long that the release of it sounded almost physical. I've seen your father's painting, he said. My attorney showed me the photographs from the court filing. He stopped. He got it right. Every detail. He had maybe 40 minutes in that storage unit before he couldn't anymore. His jaw worked. 40 minutes and he got every face right. He was always exact, Emma said. Guidry looked at his hands. I didn't want to be there. I want you to know that not because it changes anything, it doesn't. I know it doesn't, but because I've needed to say it to someone for 12 years. He looked up at her. I was in debt to Langley. Serious debt. He told me it was just to run the car, that it was just to make sure Parker didn't reach anyone before Langley could manage the situation. His voice broke slightly. He said managed. I believe that meant something different from what it meant. Emma said nothing. She kept her face still and her hands flat on the table. When I understood what had actually happened, it was too late to undo it, and I was too scared to confess it and too implicated to walk away. Guidry pressed both hands flat on the table. I've spent 12 years being scared, and I am tired. I am so tired of it. He looked at Emma directly. I'll tell the investigators everything. Dates, conversations, Langley's instructions, what I saw, what I did, everything. His voice was very quiet. It won't bring him back. I know that. No, Emma said. It won't. But it's what I have, Guidry said. Emma looked at him for a long moment, at a man destroyed from the inside by something he'd chosen not to choose, but had failed to stop. And she felt something complicated move through her that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't fury and wasn't absolution. It was something more like recognition, the recognition of what fear costs when you let it run long enough. Give your statement, she said. Tell the truth completely. That's what he would have wanted. She paused. That's all he ever wanted. Guidry nodded once and his attorney began taking notes, and outside the conference room window, the Arizona afternoon was bright and indifferent and going on regardless, the way afternoons do. Victor Langley was arrested on a Wednesday morning 8 weeks after Emma Parker had walked into a garage with a sketchbook and asked if she could paint motorcycles for tips. The charges were substantial fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and one count connected to the events on Route 9 12 years prior that the prosecutor's office had been building carefully since Guidry's statement. Langley's attorneys were present at the arrest, which meant he'd known it was coming, which meant the fear Emma had seen in his eyes at the courthouse had been fully realized in the weeks since. Emma heard about it from Hoyt, who called at 7 in the morning with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been doing this work for 30 years and still felt the particular weight of a moment like this. It's not the end of the process, Hoyt said. There's a long road between an arrest and a verdict. You understand that. I understand, Emma said. But the painting is entered into evidence. Guidry's statement is on record. Bowen's recovered witness statement is on record. Yen, Chu's financial analysis is on record. He paused. Your father built something that survived 12 years and the best attorney money could buy. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Emma sat with it, though. She was in the garage when she got the call at the workbench, where she'd been spending most of her mornings lately, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the work was where she felt most like herself, most like the person her father had been building toward, something without knowing what the something was. She set the phone down and picked up a brush and held it without moving for a moment. Then she put it down again and called her mother. Her mother picked up on the first ring this time. I heard, her mother said before Emma could speak. Her voice was something Emma had never quite heard from her before. Not relief, not grief, not triumph. Somewhere between all three in the place where complicated things live when they've finally been allowed to be complicated. Rosa called me 10 minutes ago. Mom, Emma, her mother's voice was very steady. He knew you'd find it. I want you to know that I think he knew. Not consciously, not with a plan, but somewhere in him when he rolled that canvas up and wrapped it twice and tied it with that knot he always used. She stopped. He knew. Emma closed her eyes. I think so too, she said. They were quiet together for a moment, the two of them, across a phone line from Tucson to a garage in rural Arizona, carrying the same weight from different ends the way they always had. Come home soon, her mother said. Soon, Emma said. There's something I need to do first. The memorial ride was Hammer's idea, and it came together the way things come together in a community that has been waiting for permission to grieve properly, fast, organic, and larger than anyone had planned for. It was scheduled for a Saturday in late October, 6 months after Emma had first walked through the gate. What had been intended as a chapter event became something else entirely when the word spread. Veterans organizations sent representatives. Former members who had moved to other states called to say they were coming. People who had known Daniel Parker in contexts entirely separate from the chapter customers who'd commissioned work, artists who'd known him from shows and galleries, people from the neighborhood where he'd grown up, appeared at the chapter lot on Saturday morning in numbers that made the parking situation genuinely complicated. Emma moved through all of it with the particular calm that comes after a very long period of sustained focus has finally reached its resolution. She talked to people, shook hands, listened to stories about her father she'd never heard before, received them with the open attention of someone who understood that every story was a piece of a person she was still assembling, still learning, still earning the right to fully know. Pete stayed close to her all morning without being obvious about it the way he'd been doing for months. She'd stopped being surprised by it. She'd started being grateful for it in a way she didn't always know how to say. Rosa had organized the catering and the logistics with the precise efficiency Emma had come to expect from her. And at one point in the morning, Emma caught Rosa watching her from across the lot with an expression that was very close to the expression Emma's mother sometimes wore. The expression of a woman watching someone she's decided to look out for and has stopped trying to explain. Dutch said nothing all morning as usual and was somehow present everywhere as usual. Carl arrived late and parked at the far end of the lot and stood by himself for a few minutes before Emma walked over to him. He looked at her when she approached, and his jaw was doing the tight thing again. You kept the key, Emma said. I kept the key, he said. Thank you, Carl. He nodded once, the nod of a man who doesn't trust himself to speak right now, and Emma put her hand briefly on his arm and then moved on because Carl was the kind of person who needed you to know that you understood and then needed you to let him carry it the rest of the way himself. The ride left at noon, 212 motorcycles, the largest gathering the chapter had ever hosted, rolling out in formation with a noise that Emma felt in her sternum and recognized finally and completely as the sound of her earliest memory. She rode in the support vehicle again with Rosa. This time they talked the whole way. Not about the case, not about Langley, not about courts or attorneys or evidence, just about Daniel Parker. Stories Emma hadn't heard, stories Rosa had been holding for years, waiting for the right person to tell them to. By the time the ride came back, Emma knew her father in ways she hadn't known him that morning. That was the gift the day kept giving each person who'd known him. adding one more piece, one more specific true thing, building a person out of accumulated testimony, the way her father had built truth into accumulated paint. At the end of the event, when the crowd had gathered in the main lot and the food had been eaten and the stories had been told and the light was doing what late October afternoon light does in Arizona, long and amber, and particular Hammer stepped up onto the back of a truck bed and called for quiet. The crowd settled. "Most of you know why we're here," Hammer said. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. His voice carried the way voices carry when the person using them has everyone's full attention. Daniel Parker was a brother, an artist, a man who found the truth when it was inconvenient to find it and documented it when it was dangerous to document it and trusted that someone would eventually come looking. He paused. Someone came looking. He looked at Emma standing at the edge of the gathered crowd. "She's been with us for 6 months now," he said. "She walked in here with a sketchbook and her father's hands and her father's eyes and more courage than most people twice her age will ever find." Another pause. "She asked if she could paint our bikes 4 tips." A sound moved through the crowd, not quite laughter, not quite tears, something in between that was uniquely human. "We owe her something better than tips," Hammer said. "So tonight she's going to show us something she's been working on for the last 3 months. And after that, anyone who wants to say something about Daniel Parker can say it." He stepped down from the truck. Emma. Emma walked to the center of the lot where a large canvas had been mounted on a frame that Deke and 2 other members had built and positioned facing the crowd. It was covered with a black cloth. She stood in front of it and looked at the 200 people looking at her. She thought about what to say. She decided not to say anything. She reached up and pulled the black cloth free. The crowd went silent so completely that the sound of the cloth falling was audible. The painting was large, 8 feet by 5 feet, the biggest thing Emma had ever made. She had worked on it every evening for 3 months in the garage, after everyone else had gone alone with the work the way her father had taught her to be alone with the work. It showed a highway, not a specific highway. The highway, the one that exists in the imagination of everyone who has ever understood that the road is not a metaphor, but a truth. And on that highway, rendered with every technique her father had taught her and everything she had learned since 90 riders moving forward together. At the front, slightly ahead of the rest, rode a man with large, capable hands and dark brown eyes, and the particular posture of someone who had made peace with the road he was on. Behind him, very small on a tiny bicycle with training wheels, a blonde girl in a yellow jacket pedaling hard to keep up. Halfway down the highway, further along, the same girl, older now, 17 or 18, riding something real riding beside him. And above all of them, painted in the clear, precise letter forms her father had taught her, 4 words. Family is the road. That was all. No period, no elaboration. Just the truth stated simply in the way that simple, true things withstand everything. Pete made a sound beside her that he immediately tried to contain and couldn't. Deke turned away and faced the other direction for a moment. Dutch, who never showed anything, pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked up at the sky. Hammer stood very still, looking at the painting, and Emma watched him find the man at the front of the highway and look at him for a long time, and whatever passed across Hammer's face in that moment was between him and Daniel Parker, and Emma had the grace to look away and let it be private. The crowd was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of people who don't know what to say. The silence of people who have been given something that requires a moment to receive properly. Then the first person started clapping. Then the second. Then it was everyone all at once, and Emma stood in the middle of it and felt it move through her, and she thought about 11 hours on a Greyhound bus, and a sketchbook, and a box of paintbrushes, and the particular way her father had always tied a double knot on work he needed to last. She had lasted. The work had lasted. The truth had lasted. Rosa appeared at her shoulder and said nothing. Just put her hand briefly on Emma's back, the gesture of a woman who understood that some moments don't need words. Pete came to stand on her other side. Carl materialized at the edge of her vision. Dutch was there, and Deke and Jimmy and Bev and all the rest of them assembled around her the way they had assembled around her father for 20 years, without announcement, without ceremony, simply because that was what they did for their own. Hammer walked over and stood in front of her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first day in the garage over the sketchbook. Complete attention, complete assessment, the full weight of a person who took nothing lightly. You came here for answers, he said. I did, Emma said. Did you find them? Emma looked at the painting at the highway, at the riders, at her father at the front of all of it, and herself behind him and beside him, and the four words above them that said everything that needed to be said. I found more than answers, she said. I found what he was trying to tell me. What was that? Hammer said. Emma looked at him. At all of them. At the 200 people standing in the late October light in an Arizona lot. People who had kept a storage unit locked out of loyalty and a key in a drawer for 4 years, and a file in a garage for 11 years, and a memory alive for 12 people who had ridden beside her father and were now standing beside his daughter, because that was simply what you did for your own. Because the road didn't end at the last person who walked it, because what you built in love and honesty lasted longer than the people trying to bury it. He was trying to tell me, Emma said quietly, that he never really left. Nobody spoke. The amber light held everything still for one long moment, the painting, the crowd, the late afternoon, the 12 years of absence that had become in 6 months, and through the work of many hands, something closer to presence than anyone had expected to find. And in that moment, 200 people who had known Daniel Parker or learned to know him through his daughter understood something true and complete and final. He had painted the truth into everything he touched, and the truth given enough time and the right pair of hands always finds its way home.